members of Congress what a $2,000 tax hike would mean to you. Call your members of Congress. Write them an email, post it on their Facebook walls. You can tweet it using the hashtag #My2K. Not Y2K, My2K.
That was President Barack Obama last week, pushing through the My2K plan. He then followed that up today by going onto Twitter to have a town hall conversation about the fiscal cliff. Joining us now from Washington, D.C. is Tim Hanrahan to talk about this Twitter conversation. How did it go?
Well, you know, it went pretty well. I looked at one of these about a year ago. I think it was the IMF chief was having a Twitter conversation, Christine Lagarde. And, you know, it's Twitter, so people tweet questions. He chooses which ones to answer. You know, he's very selective about it. But the conversation flowed pretty well. It was fairly easy to follow. I think people have learned how to use Twitter better, and you just followed the hashtag, you know, My2K, and followed the White House official account. You could sort of, you know, get a sense of the president's thinking on it today.
Terrific. And the funny thing is, we were looking through the question and answer session. The White House tweeted a picture of President Obama's hand over a keyboard to prove this was actually him and not his staff answering the questions. Were there other interesting things of the course of this back and forth that stood out as particularly either engaging or interesting?
Well, it's tricky to be engaging because the questions have to be very short, and Obama can choose which questions to answer. And also his answers have to be very short too. So people ask him fairly complicated questions about tax rates or, you know, or limitations on deductions. And he can answer them, but he answers them very briefly. I was surprised by that picture as well. It really did seem to show exactly what you just said, which is the president is actually reading Twitter himself, answering the questions himself, and typing, which, you know, would seem very strange, you know, 3, 4, 5 years ago. In terms of the questions, go ahead.
Well, it's also interesting here in terms of, I guess, the back and forth that we've seen from political leaders from both the right and the left. I mean, they are also trying to garner some public backing for what they're trying to do. And this is part of that campaign, right? This is part of President Obama trying to get people behind his plan. He's just not taking an hour out of his day for his health, I guess.
Yeah, it's part of this public relations campaign that he's been on, you know, with the My2K hashtag last week, and then continuing it today. He seemed to be focused today really on, you know, raising tax rates for the wealthiest Americans, people with, or households with over, you know, $250,000 in income, and sort of pushing that point. Again, on Twitter, because of the limitations, you can't really get too far into the weeds, which is actually probably good for President Obama, who does have a tendency to sometimes get a little too deep into the details without sticking to the core message, which in this case was why we need to raise, or why he thinks we need to raise taxes on the wealthiest households. It was interesting, one questioner said, well, wait a second, instead of raising rates, why don't we limit deductions, which is what the GOP has proposed. And Obama again said, look, I don't think that raises enough money unless we limit deductions on things like charities, which of course are a very popular deduction. So it was a middling, you know, it was an okay experience. I think if you're going to have a serious debate about, you know, about taxes and the deficit and the fiscal cliff, this wasn't necessarily the best place to have it, but it went off pretty well. I mean, he answered 7 or 8 questions in about, you know, 45 minutes, you know, and it was executed fairly well.
Terrific. Well, thank you so much. That was Tim Hanrahan from our Washington, D.C. bureau.